This week, Labour has been in power exactly 1 year. What have they achieved? Rachel, why don't you kick us off by telling us your memories of those first few days of Labour once it came into power?
There was an atmosphere of we can breathe out now, and I remember the two speeches on the steps of Downing Street, which actually doesn't have steps. The two speeches outside Downing Street, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, and it kind of really signalling change, and this being the first election that brought in a new Prime Minister since 2010, and that being actually, like, we've had elections since then, but we haven't had like that kind of, you have the election, you stay up all night, and then like the government has completely changed the next day. And even then, like, it took in 2010 it took a week or so to decide who the Prime Minister was going to be, so you didn't have that kind of instant sort of sea change moment. And I remember a lot of the commentary being about how, okay, we've had the chaos, we've had the Tory psychodrama, we've had, constant speculation about who's going to be the Prime Minister, how long the Prime Minister is going to last, constant, the story was not about policy, it was about infighting, and there was a sense, there were columns about it, I may have written one about how, okay, now we could just focus on actually some of the really tough challenges facing the country that we hadn't been able to deal with while we've been doing all the psychodrama, and how nice that was. And now we're here.
Well, I remember that, I was watching it as more of a citizen than a journalist at the time, but I remember thinking that it was quite symbolic, and it said something about how sort of class was back in terms of Labour's rhetoric, at least. Keir Starmer talked about working class families like mine in that first speech outside Number 10. I think Rachel Reeves mentioned working class opportunities for working class children when she introduced herself to the Treasury civil servants. And of course, that cabinet, I think it was the least privately educated cabinet that we've had in modern times. And so it symbolically felt like a shift as well.
It really did. I, like most people, I was sitting at home watching it on the telly that first day overnight. I was absolutely stunned by how many Tory seats had fallen. I had no idea quite so many were going to go. I'd seen quite a bit of Keir Starmer privately. He lives not far from me before the election, and he'd been in and out the house. We've been talking. And so I'd seen him close up. And I've been kind of eyeing him, thinking, is this really the next Prime Minister? And I think he'd been wondering that himself, been lots of kind of, conversations about that. So seeing him suddenly in Downing Street, I thought he already looks a bit different. He looks very, very comfortable with power. He looks comfortable with that suit, sitting in that chair. And yes, all those unexpected people, the Angela Rayners and the Bridget Phillipsons going up that famous street. I thought this was a moment of extraordinary hope. I didn't realise even then, I wasn't asking myself, where is Emily Thornberry? Where is Nick Thomas-Symonds? Already there were, big personnel mistakes or embarrassments going on behind the scenes. Nick Thomas-Symonds, hadn't even been told by his very, very good friend Keir Starmer that he wasn't actually at that point meant to be around the cabinet table. Other people had similarly, he'd forgotten to invite. So behind the scenes, there was already chaos. But from the outside, it looked really, really impressive and really, really powerful. I think, like a lot of people, I was naively over-optimistic. I thought, after the Tory chaos, it must get better. This is a government with a long-term strategy for investment and repair and renewal. And indeed, a lot of that remains the case. But I did not expect to understand quite so quickly how much those old disregarded political skills of communication and feeling and touch and tact, how much they meant.
Yeah, and of course the subplot of that election day result was Reform's success, Tom. That's something that slightly took the shine off the landslide, I think, even in those early days.
Yeah, do you remember, wasn't the exit poll predicting that they were going to get many more seats than they actually got, Reform? I think the exit poll from memory said something like
13.
12
or 13, yeah.
And this was a kind of breakthrough moment for Farage that was then sort of tampered by that sort of, the actual result of 5 MPs, which he's now lost one already and then added one back in. I was just picking something up from what Andrew was saying there about that sense that did Keir Starmer believe that he was going to be Prime Minister? And did the Labour Party believe that they were actually going to win, whatever the polls were saying? And maybe there is some interplay with the working class element of the party, and that they were on the brink of power and this breakthrough election victory, but they couldn't quite convince themselves that this was going to happen. And that has stopped them from planning for power. So you speak to any of the people around him and they were just, we have got to win. The Tories always find a way to defeat us, to sort of, somehow...
Can't believe it till it's happened.
Exactly. And they're all scarred by, I think a lot of them actually look beyond Tony Blair. They look to Neil Kinnock and they have that sort of constant sense of fear that we are going to be Neil Kinnock again and we're going to lose this somehow. And I think it's really hobbled them in government.
I was with Neil Kinnock on that terrible night. An absolute white-faced despair in Wales, driving back to London, and all across central London, groups of young Conservatives cheering and dancing in the streets and thinking this is just awful, awful, awful. So I think, yeah, you're right, they had those scars. But I also think, thinking back to the pieces that you were writing, the interviews that you did for that piece on Keir Starmer, Tom, I think the word is internalise. I think he internalises a lot of this, and he thinks, I am the outsider, always have been. I'm the working class man who's always been underestimated. They always say I can't do it, and I always do it. So in a sense, I don't need to think too much. I don't need to plan too much before becoming Prime Minister, because when I am Prime Minister, it will be all right.
And there's a belief in
It
the
always
machine
is.
there
It always-
as well, isn't there? As someone who headed the CPS, there's a belief that the machine will crank into action once you're in charge. I think he's sort of finding that that's really not the case now. That there are sort of levers that you try and pull and they don't sort of attach to anything.
He's talked about that a lot, the need to rewire the state. We haven't seen very much of it, mind you.
No.
We haven't.
Well, one thing I think is part of that's not just a Keir Starmer mindset, but a Labour mindset more generally, is we know that the previous Conservative governments didn't work well with the civil service, and they were often blaming the civil service. And I think because if you're of the left, you're more likely to have a slightly more positive view of the state, and also because various Conservative Prime Ministers went so hard on it's the civil service's fault, there was a belief that when a Labour government came in with Labour ministers, the civil service would say, oh my goodness, thank you, you're here. Here are all the great ideas that we didn't bother to give the Conservatives. Or now we've got Labour ministers. We can fix all the things that we just didn't feel able to fix with those awful Tories beforehand.
Yeah.
And not to blame individual civil servants, because I think they're working incredibly hard, many of them, and the wider structural problems of Whitehall are not the fault of individuals. But I think it's sort of telling that the Labour ministers came in and many of the challenges with getting the state to kick into gear, getting the Whitehall machine to work, persisted because they weren't about evil Tory ministers. They were about something more
I think
fundamental.
that's absolutely right. And there were warning signs even back then that we should have thought more about. I can remember being in number 11 Downing Street for a dinner before the election with a whole bunch of very, very senior Treasury civil servants. And although the Tories were in power at the time, Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor, when Rachel Reeves's name came up, there was a kind of very profound, deep background purring noise, like a 1930s Rolls Royce kind of warming up. They just loved the thought of Rachel Reeves being Chancellor.
Like the bond markets now.
Like the bond That's a bit more menacing, I think. That's more menacing. This was just complete approbation. Marvellous. This Rachel Reeves woman is going to come in. She's one of us. And it's going to be absolutely fine. And of course, the fact that she has been too close to Treasury orthodoxy is one of the things we've been writing about in the New Statesman ever since.
Yeah.
I think there was the same. There was a Bridget Phillips. Was it Bridget Phillipson who had this extraordinary reception in the Department for Education when she came in, and the civil servants did come out, and they were just somebody we can work with here that we're not going to fight with. But then it does come back to that sense of the civil service needs an idea of where the government is going so that they can make decisions. They need to know, okay, what is it that they want, and I can work towards that, and that is at the core of this problem.
Yeah.
Hindsight's really, really dangerous. But do you think it's all fair to say that on that first day or two of the new Labour government, we didn't get the kind of lift, the rhetorical, emotional lift that Tony Blair provided back in 1997?
Totally. I think
It wasn't there, was it?
No, and Starmer now regrets that speech that he gave, which was sort of too doom and gloom.
Yeah, so I think the key moment is not necessarily the speeches he gave, like in the days afterwards, but that speech that he gave tail end of the summer in the garden at Downing Street, where it was a really odd speech. I was watching it, where it was, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it really was a very doom and gloom speech. And you kept, as a journalist watching it, you kept sort of waiting for him to get to the "and here's how we get out of it" bit.
However, nevertheless,
he just didn't.
Yeah, I think what struck me watching it, as I say from afar, was that I felt they were trying to focus too much on, remember that it was the Conservatives that wrecked the economy. They were trying to do the post-Gordon Brown, what the Tories did to Labour's reputation on economic competence, the £22 billion black hole. It felt always a little bit too forced to me. The country already had made up its mind about how the Conservatives had performed economically.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, though, I think the Labour Party in 97 repeated Black Wednesday until about 2008. So it can sort of... It can last, and it sticks in people's mind.
I asked some pollsters and people who run focus groups, why is it that George Osborne was able to use, last Labour government crashed the economy all the way up to the 2015 election. Actually, you had Conservatives using it in 2019 and beyond, and Labour got kind of 3 months to use that, and then people got tired of it.
Yeah.
And there's two reasons that I heard was, one, people are just sick of being told there's no money, and it's just not a message that they want to hear from anyone, whether it's the Conservatives' fault or Labour's fault. And the other one, which I think is probably more relevant to what happens next, or where we go from here, is that people vote in Labour governments because they want them to spend money and fix public services. And it's a message that they can kind of accept from the Conservatives more than they can accept from a Labour government, because with the Conservatives, they go, yes, we voted you in because you're a safe pair of hands. With Labour, they go, well, then what's the point of you?
Yeah.
It's the second part of the sentence, isn't it? Things are really, really bad. This is what we've inherited. And the bit that was missing, so here's what we're going to do, and here's how it's going to feel better.
Yeah,
it was that last bit that was missing.
And I will throw out a defence of Starmer here, which is that I think he is correct when he says that other Labour governments have inherited a situation where you could say that the Tories have run down public services, but often they inherit an economy where it is growing and you can start to spend money. Where he inherited a situation with an economy that was terrible, in a terrible situation, no money left, and public services were in a terrible position. I think fundamentally that is true. Like that the record of the Conservative government is not just lamentable, but probably the worst in post-war history, of a combined record of 2010 to 2024. I don't think you can come up with a worse predecessor.
I think it's the only parliament where living standards were lower at the end of the parliament than at the beginning.
But I remember those early months of Starmer's government, he coped with those riots well, I thought. I thought he came across well. He acted nimbly, and they really hit on the head what could have been an extremely toxic situation that could have escalated. I think they coped with that well. And then equally, I remember sort of seeing the TV footage of him and Wes Streeting, ties tucked into their shirts, sleeved rolled up in hospitals, bringing down the waiting list, and actually waiting lists have been going down. So those are my sort of early reflections on things that I felt that they were coping with well.
I think the waiting list is going to go down as one of their big achievements.
Yeah.
And we'll see how effectively Wes is able to reform the NHS over the next 3 or 4 years, assuming he's still there. But I think the NHS will go down as an achievement. It's got by far the largest tranche of the money that Rachel Reeves raised in investment and in these very, very tight spending reviews. It's been the department doing better and better and better. And if you look, for instance, at reform voters, it's not immigration. It's not even cost of living that's the number one priority for them. It's the NHS. It's a nationwide thing. It's one of those very few areas where you can achieve absolute transformation with one single policy area.
Yeah.
I think there is a caveat. I agree with you about the riots. I think there is a caveat that there is this kind of scar that has been left. And obviously Starmer had that problem with Musk, didn't he, for a while?
Oh, yes.
This kind of two-tier Keir thing. And I've spoken to a few people who have gone to some of these sort of riot towns, and they're saying that for a lot of Labour MPs, if they represent riot towns, they're in a very, very vulnerable position going into the next election, that there is this feeling of resentment that is still there. So I'm slightly worried about that. It's like a festering wound of something that hasn't gone away. The other achievement I think is worth mentioning is Europe. And this is something where I think Keir has been noticeably different and quite grown up compared to his predecessors. I was listening to a rival podcast, the Ed Balls and George Osborne one, where they were both saying, oh, Keir should have been much more political in his negotiations with Europe. He should have set a red line and out in the public that he knew he could win, and he should have had a fight with the Europeans and come back and declared victory, and that's how you negotiate with Europe. I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, but that's what you did, and look where we ended up. That's where every prime minister. Going back to we were chatting about Margaret Thatcher before we came on air. Everyone tries to replicate Margaret Thatcher, and nobody has ever succeeded in the sort of handbagging her way to a rebate. They all fail, and actually, I think Starmer has landed a renegotiation of Europe with almost no pushback, no protest in the country, and everyone's gone, am I going to be able to get into Spain without going through those dark queues?
Yeah, no, I think you can get even more widely, sorry to jump in, and say he's been a very successful foreign affairs prime minister generally. I think the lead he took on defence, I was worried for a while that we were going to head towards a kind of ersatz European army fighting the Russians in Ukraine, but he pulled back from that. And I think the way that he has handled Trump, a very, very difficult man to handle, it wasn't always elegant and it didn't look very dignified at times when he was handing over the King's letter and all the rest of it, but overall it worked. And when you think what Trump has said about our sister country, Canada, and the things that could have gone wrong around that, and how close we came to really severe tariffs on cars and steel making and aluminium, I think that's a more or less win-win-win-win for Starmer. He's done very, very well there. And, that then, of course, leads it home to never hear Keir.
Well, there were three trade deals. There was the EU, the US, and India. The US one is complicated just because Trump is complicated and changes his mind on a daily basis on what he's offering or not offering. But I agree that all world leaders are grappling with how to deal with Trump, and I think Starmer is doing better than many of them and managing, but better than many people thought, thinking, right-wing president, left-wing UK prime minister, there's going to be a clash, there's going to be tension. Actually, he seems to be one of the world leaders who's got a better relationship with Trump. I think the EU deal definitely is a success, although I think like some of the comms around it, and getting back to the comms narrative, hasn't been as powerful as it could be. The conversation was all about fish, and we talked about it on the podcast about fishing rights or whatever, and the conversation wasn't cheaper food in supermarkets, like lowering prices for consumers, and that's huge. Like if what you want to do is tackle the cost of living, that cheaper food and streamlined imports and also streamlined exports, because most of our fish that we catch here we actually export to Europe and elsewhere, like that stuff really matters too. And it kind of, I heard some of that, but I didn't hear as much of that as I would expect, given what an achievement I think that is.
Can I add a note of criticism on foreign affairs? 2 points. I'm just thinking about it as we were talking there. I think a lot of our listeners will probably be screaming Gaza when they're thinking about us and talking about foreign affairs, and I think that probably comes back again to a sense that a lot of us have of Starmer, which he is unable to. I think we all think he feels it. I personally think he is a moral man, and he thinks and worries about these things, but he doesn't often express it in kind of clear moral terms, and is able to sort of set a direction and then explain that. And I think on Gaza, I think that's quite palpable, his failure on that. And I think he's probably very, very conflicted. I think you've had a few lines of that, Andrew, in your reporting. The other point, do you remember in the White House when the deal was done between the UK and the US, and Mandelson was stood behind Trump, and Mandelson wrote the diary for us a few weeks ago, and in it he says that he wasn't expecting to be called. And Trump just turned around and said, "What do you think?" And then Mandelson had to think on his feet. And in that moment, listening to Peter Mandelson, and Andrew's probably listened to him 1,000 times, he was an extraordinary politician. you remembered that Peter Mandelson is this kind of feline political figure who's just able to just turn it on like that. And I thought, he's actually better than Keir Starmer as a political speaker.
Those kind of basic skills. I have to say, my memory of Peter Mandelson's voice was when I was political editor of the BBC, and I had done something on the 10 o'clock news which might not have been terribly attractive to Tony Blair's government. And I get back to my office, the first thing that would happen is my phone would go. I'd pick it up. Andrew, it's Peter here. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for you. And I said, what do you mean, Peter? I'm so sorry for your career. It was going so well. I'm afraid that foolish, hurtful, silly thing that you said about Tony on the news has done you no good whatever. And I'm very sorry to say, I like you, Andrew, and I'm afraid I'm having drinks with the Director General, Lord Burt, shortly.
Wow.
Again and again and again.
It's like he's in the room.
So I can't hear that voice with quite the same feeling.
No, I mean that's just him. That's him. But it's just he just loves the game, doesn't he?
He does.
Mandelson loves the game, and I think that's probably why you can't become prime minister if you love it that much. If you love the game, rather than, but
you need to love the game a bit, and that's one of the things we've been talking about really with Keir, isn't it?
He doesn't.
He doesn't love the game.
No, he hates the game.
He hates the game, and he hates the other players of the game, and he doesn't see himself. I think that's what's really interesting, and it came across in your profile of him, Tom. And it's sort of you get bits and pieces of it. He doesn't see himself as somebody who is playing the game, despite the fact that he has got to the top of the game. And I think that's a kind of weird cognitive dissonance that is kind of at the heart of a lot of the errors that he's making. Is that does he think he's playing a different game to everyone else?
Straight sets, but I've never really played tennis before.
Okay, well, let's look ahead to the future then. Labour's doing poorly in the polls. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have had a terrible week, the week that we're recording. The Chancellor in tears in the Commons. I mean, first of all, let's talk about personnel. Do you think that there are likely to be major cabinet changes anytime soon?
I think there has to be a reshuffle at some point this year, and probably either during the summer or after the summer. And I admire, in many ways, Liz Kendall. I think she's a formidable politician. I think she has very strong views. But she has had the absolute centre, the pith, the meaning of her reforms ripped out in the House of Commons. And I think it's very, very hard to see where she goes from there. So that's one place I'm afraid I would start.
I think they should bring back Emily Thornberry to the front bench. Role to be discussed. But one of the things they lack are people who are there are different ways of being a good communicator, but one way to be a good communicator is to be a bit fun and a bit punchy and a bit interesting, and to not just it's not just repeating the sound bites that you've been given again and again and again and again and again.
You're so
and
right.
she's really good at that.
Right. You're so right. What she has got a great snort. When I'm interviewing you say something provocative about the government, and you get an Emily Thornberry snort, and she laughs at you and she ridicules you, and she has huge self-confidence of that kind. Yeah. And you're right, quite right. We need a bit more.
You need some of that energy.
Cabinet.
She got Riz. Would we say she's got Riz? I'm not sure if I'm using that word right.
We need one of the younger members of staff to come and explain to us whether or not she's got Riz. Yes, it's that Wes Streeting quality, isn't it? You answer the question, you're not always on message, but people feel that you're talking like a human being. Yeah. Tom, Andrew mentioned Rachel Reeves' position. I think that's probably what most people are considering at the time of our recording. What do you reckon to
she
her
now
future?
looks sort of completely safe, doesn't she? I mean, the bond markets came to her rescue. And Keir Starmer was forced to say, not only is she safe, she's safe until the election and many years after, I think he said this morning, which is a fairly extraordinary thing to say. So she looks very safe at the moment, which is a problem fundamentally for this government, because they actually do need a refresh. They need a sense of a change of direction. I mean, Keir Starmer's virtually said that himself. I mean, he's given 3 lengthy interviews to 3 profilers, me included, and then one in the Observer and one in the Sunday Times. They were clearly setting out to try and shape the narrative. They kind of failed, and then Keir Starmer started apologising for his first year in office. So said essentially, "I'm really sorry, I got everything wrong." And that is not a look that the Prime Minister needs to be giving at all. People look to a Prime Minister to show strength and conviction, to be stronger than us, to be kind of... I think you want the Prime Minister, somebody who's making decisions on your behalf, to be almost better than you, to be more confident, somehow to give you the sense that they know things that you don't, and they have a sense of where they're going, even when they're sort of dodging and weaving. And so I think the challenge to his authority is really great. And Rachel Reeves is at the centre of this. Now, I think we've got ourselves into this strange position where not only can the bond market seemingly get rid of a government with Liz Truss, they can now seemingly stop a reshuffle with a Labour government. That is, I don't think, a healthy position for a country to be in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Keir didn't only double down, he tripled down, perhaps quadrupled down, having, I thought, conspicuously failed to say the things that would calm her position yesterday in the House of Commons, when, she was very, very upset, and he was talking about himself, and he could have very easily, I would have thought, found the words to say, and this is the woman, under whose watch the Bank of England has cut interest rates 4 times, under whose watch we've got the strongest business confidence for 9 years, etc. It wouldn't have been difficult.
He didn't look at her.
And he didn't look at her, and he didn't do it. So I think he had to go very, very hard the other way when the bond market. But it's an ironic thing, because the bond markets have always been the great outside constraint on this government. The bond markets and the promises they made on tax during the election together produced, as it were, the fiscal problem, which produced the welfare policy, which in turn produced the political crisis.
We haven't been here since the 70s, right? So
No.
I don't think this was a part of our national politics from at some point during Margaret Thatcher's term in office. That stopped being a sort of looming threat to the country. I think there was a run at some point on the pound under Thatcher.
But in those days, it was always the pound. It wasn't the bond markets as such. It wasn't gilt. It was the pound.
Yeah.
And the pound has indeed fallen a bit as well since the events in the Commons.
But we've moved into a new era, I think. So I think for a lot of listeners, if they're thinking in terms of eras, we might think of sort of 97 as a point of change up until today. And that era, or maybe that runs to Liz Truss. Maybe that's the sort of the period we need to think about, where the bond markets were not this looming presence. They now are, and that's shaping everything going forward.
Because we borrowed too much.
Yeah.
We borrowed it. But it's not just us. I mean, they are hovering over almost all the Western economies in different ways.
Including the Americans.
Including the Americans, very much so. Like sort of kites or vultures in the sky, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And when something like the Chancellor of the Exchequer bursting into tears in the House of Commons happens, they swoop. And they swoop very fast.
Well, another force sort of haunting every decision that Labour makes is Nigel Farage. Your column, Andrew, in this week's magazine. Farage will likely be our next Prime Minister and his party is preparing for power, is the headline. We talked a bit about reforms breakthrough at the general election. How much are they shaping the way that Labour conducts itself?
Well, this is meant to be just a kind of slap across the chops for us and most of our readers, because I think we've all been accustomed to Nigel Farage and reform as the kind of irritant upstarts, obsessed by the boats on the edge of politics. And if you talk to the pollsters, the serious pollsters who've been doing deep work, the more you look at this, the more we have to start to think about them differently. We have to start to think about them as a possible, probable, even likely party of government, because there's almost no way back for the Tories at the moment, and they are so far ahead in the polls. And it's been months and months now. It's not a flash in the pan thing. And so I thought, let's just look at them afresh, as it were, as a potential party of government. Who are the think tanks they're talking to? Who are the thinkers that are influencing them? To what extent are they reorganising and professionalising? To what extent does Nigel Farage himself really start to see himself as a potential Prime Minister? Is he changing his behaviour? So this is meant to be a salutary shock for New Statesman readers.
I think the key point for me when I was like, the professionalism, the realisation is serious, was when Zia Youssef quit, and within 48 hours he came back, and it was clear that he had come back after lengthy conversations with Nigel Farage. And if you look at Nigel Farage's history, often when there were personnel disputes, Farage comes out on top, and the people either are never heard from again, or they go out in the wilderness for a bit and they come back. But the speed of that, I know he came back in a slightly different role, but the speed of that suggested to me that Nigel went to him and said, we need you. And why would you have somebody like Zia Youssef high up in your party? It can only be because you've suddenly got way more people than you know what to do with, as in members and activists and things. You've got more money than you've had before. You are trying to run a national campaign that is a serious campaign about winning as opposed to just being an irritant. And you need somebody with experience of running organisations that have those hierarchies in order to achieve that.
I thought there was a really, really interesting moment a few weeks ago when Nigel Farage was doing a press conference, I think in Wales, and Tamara Cohen of Sky News asked him the obvious question we've just been talking about, which is, you are too big beast. You kick other people out. You can't get on with people. It's all your fault. Going back to UKIP and the Brexit Party and now Reform, it's always the same. It's always you. And he started off really testy, doing his usual Nigel Farage thing of attacking the question, a typical media narrative, thank you, very, very, very obvious, and being menacing about people around him. And then you could see him visibly stop halfway through his answer and think, hold on a second. And he suddenly stops and he catches himself and he says, I do understand the question. I do understand the narrative. And yes, if I'm going to be Prime Minister, I do have to reach out and build a bigger team. And I thought, I've never seen Nigel Farage stop in public and catch himself like that.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting moment.
That is interesting, yeah.
And that is him. You imagine in his mind, is he thinking, I might be Prime Minister? Suddenly, probably for the first time in his career, he's thinking, God, I might screw this up. I've got a chance. This is everything my life has been building towards. And so he starts checking himself. He starts bringing people back from the cold because it means something.
And I was very, very struck by one of the senior people in Reform I spoke to for this piece, who said, we're very, very concerned. We've been looking very closely at Labour's failure. They spent far too much campaigning to win the election, as we have just been talking about, and too little time preparing for the government. And we don't want to make that mistake. So they've got lots of KCs working pro bono, drafting legislation already, including a great repeal bill, and drafting the legislation on deportations and so forth. It's all being done already. And they've got some very serious people involved.
I think this is is this Trump first term, kind of Farage, is that what we're looking at? The kind of chaos, the populism, all of that? Or have they looked at Labour and have they looked at Trump second term, where you had, I think it was the Heritage Foundation in Washington, who was looking at this and came up with, what was it called? Project 2025. Now, Trump always sort of distanced himself from that. But what is also going on is sort of conservative-leaning think tanks who are saying or looking at the polls and going, well, of course the Tories are not going to win. We need to present a project, a plan to reform. And so they're all working on it. And they're sort of looking to influence Nigel Farage.
Other little straws in the wind. We've had Simon Case, the former cabinet secretary, suggesting that for the pre-election talks with the civil service, reform should be brought into that. And we've had the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, writing to Richard Tice, the number 2 at Reform, about Tice's very, very strongly held view that the Bank of England is screwing up the country with its monetary policy and its quantitative tightening and all of that. And far from sort of brushing him aside as, an irrelevant hoo-hee gnat kind of figure buzzing outside the Bank of England windows, he's been invited in for a meeting with the governor. I thought that was a very interesting moment.
That's the establishment taking reform seriously.
Hold on a second.
I think having MPs makes a big difference. Just they've never had MPs before, and the asking the questions, you can ask questions, you can write to people like the governor of the Bank of England as in the capacity as an MP, and it gives you a platform that local councils or other forms of the way people get into politics just don't.
Yeah, and on that, actually, just lastly, Labour's challenge from the other side, which is the left, who feel unrepresented by this government. Putting the left in the left behind, these people who have gone for the independent candidates, pro-Palestinian movements. You saw Jonathan Ashworth lose his seat, actually, at the election, and Wes Streeting nearly lose his. So, this is something that Labour has to take seriously as well. How is that factoring in the minds of those in power?
I think hugely. And, I mean, Andrew's piece is remarkable because of the work that you've done, just sort of looking at what's going on behind the scenes of reform. And also you include this polling that is going on that's showing how serious the threat is. The same kind of polling is taking place, is showing that Labour has reached a kind of ceiling of how many votes it is losing to reform, but the ceiling for votes it can lose to the left is still much higher. And that is now sort of concentrating minds in the Labour Party. because as you know, we've all been briefed by people who know what they're talking about, take this very seriously, that the left and the right now have to get their voters out. It's about getting the numbers out. It's about efficiency of vote. And Reform have reached 30% in the polls. And if you add the Conservative vote in some rural areas in the south, that could be a formidable voting bloc. The Labour Party was extremely efficient at the last election, but it might lose its efficiency if it starts to lose votes to a new party of the left. So if it loses 10% of its vote to, not 10% of its vote, 10%, if 10% of the country vote for a sort of Corbyn-led populist left party, that could be existential for Labour.
And the characters to look out for, I guess, are Zach Polanski, who is the leftist or socialist candidate trying to get leadership of the Greens. We don't know whether it will make it or not. We won't know until September, but he's trying quite hard. And he's got a sort of... And the other one is some character called Jeremy Corbyn, who hasn't gone away, you know. And rumours about him just today, talking quite seriously about a new party. And certainly I'm in the Commons the whole time. I see him talking to the Gaza independents.
He sits on the bench with them.
He sits on the bench with them. And to sort of figures on the left of the Labour Party, I saw him and Diane Abbott in close communication the other day. And so, you know, watch that space.
Yeah, and they share staff and things, don't they? So they are getting organised.
I think it's very reminiscent of Mélenchon in French politics, isn't it? That there is an obvious proposal here which builds on concerns about the environment, concerns about foreign policy, Gaza, concerns about inequality. You add those together and you do see a kind of coherent or semi-coherent policy there, politics, that could combine Polanski, Corbyn and the independent MPs into something formidable.
You say combine them. I combine them in terms of attitude and ethos, yes. Combine them in terms of personality, that's where I see it falling down. And one of the interesting things about that polling that George commissioned in his piece about a new left-wing movement is, yes, it would take votes from Labour, but it would also take votes from the Green. And I'm not sure there's space on the left of Labour position for both a Green Party trying to occupy that left-wing eco-populism view and Jeremy Corbyn, say, led left-wing independent group. I think that would have to merge or find some way of uniting. And the problem that the Greens have is that there is a very passionate, enthusiastic strand that is exactly like that. There's also the kind of countryside conservatives,
corduroy greens.
Greens. I think we were trying to come up with fruits for them a couple of weeks ago, and it's hard to see, people who used to vote Conservative and have gone Green because they're fed up with the Conservatives and they want to see their local countryside protected, being part of that wider movement. So it does have...
I think they just have to give that up. I think it's a metropolitan
abandon
vote.
them to the Lib Dems.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Rachel. There can be too many split-off parties, and also on the right, there's another two new parties being announced, I think, in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, Rupert Lowe's got one, Ben Habib's got one.
Everyone's got their own party.
Well,
I just think in terms of the ethos of what may happen on the left. During the Corbyn years in the Labour Party, there was a thing called the World Transformed. It was a sort of a festival, as it were, of all these groups. And I think this would be the World Transformed turned into a political party.
Yes.